I wanted to open up by saying this has been a challenging time for all of us right now with virtual schools, both on Xavier's campus as well as our younger kids, if some of you have them, with the pandemic that's going on, as well as with systematic racism. There's just been so much going on for all of us today. At the heart of everything that all of us do is our families. Outside of our families at home, we have our Xavier family, our Xavier community. And what all of us at first, when we come on Xavier, or why we came to Xavier as faculty members, was our students. And during this time, we have to realize that prior to the pandemic, several of our students were facing mental health issues, uncertainties, poverty, and even racism. But now, to add an added layer to that, we have the pandemic, which most of us, as well as our students, are feeling isolated. So how do we navigate through that? How do we assist them? Those were my questions as I pondered over how can we figure out something or a space for our faculty members. And together with the advanced team, as well as Elizabeth and Kat, we were able to have Stacy Overstreet to actually be our speaker today. And Dr. Overstreet is a professor at Tulane University in the Department of Psychology. She's also the founding member of the New Orleans Trauma-Informed School Learning Collaborative. She's going to present for us today just the philosophy and give us a framework centered around trauma-informed pedagogy. So as Elizabeth said, I want us all to put those questions that we have in the chat box so that we can engage in a wonderful discussion so that our Xavier community can know what are our next steps so that we can continue this conversation beyond today. So I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thanks, Florestina. Appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute with the slides, but I just want to say a few sort of orienting things. One is that I do appreciate you all attending the talk on the day of Scholar Strike, or the 2 days of Scholar Strike. So I do believe that just the nature of this conversation does support the racial justice movement. So I feel like we are aligned with the goals of these 2 days. And so I'm really happy to be here with you all today to dig into some of this. So just so you know a little bit about me, my history is, my research history is that I've been studying the impact of trauma on youth for the past really 25 years with an eye towards resilience. And in the past 15 years, I've really been trying to understand how we can create systems, particularly K-12 school systems, that are supportive of kids who've been exposed to trauma. So that's been my work. I just wrapped up a federally funded experimental trial of some implementation strategies for K-12 schools to use to move them towards becoming trauma-informed. So I want to just be clear that my expertise is really younger kids, K-12, but I'm happy to be a thought partner in this work for you. And really, a lot of the principles, all the principles are the same. The application of the principles are different for the college age population, and we can talk about that. But the principles work no matter what we're talking about. I also just want to name that I know you're probably excited to get to really actionable trauma-informed pedagogy discussions, like what can I do in the classroom soon and now to do this work. But it is critical that we start from a place of common understanding in these discussions so that we all have a shared understanding of what trauma is and how experienced, and particularly some time going through some of these basics before we get into the actual application. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge that we're going to be moving at a pretty quick pace today. And even at that pace, and maybe because of the pace, some of the information that I'm sharing might feel heavy to you. And we're not going to have a lot of time to process that heaviness. I also want to acknowledge that we're all coming into this conversation with our own trauma histories that have been sort of intersecting with the pandemics of COVID-19 and the pandemics of racial violence committed by police and white vigilantes. So we're walking into this space with just a lot of weight on our shoulders. And so I just want to say, grab a fidget. I have a fidget. Remember to breathe. If you need to check out for a moment, check out for a moment. But we're going to plow right ahead and dive into things. So, good. Fidgets are great. I need them all the time. Okay, so I'm going to screen share my slides. Not quite a Zoom expert yet, but we'll see what happens. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so can we see slides, Elizabeth? Thumbs up? Okay, great. Okay, cool. So then, these are the learning objectives for today in the brief half hour that I have with you, but also the half hour discussion. So I really want us to develop a common understanding of the definition and prevalence of trauma. Again, really thinking about COVID-19 and racial trauma, but the larger construct of trauma. I want us to be able to recognize how that trauma can impact the brain, behavior, and learning. And then we'll get to really the fun stuff, right? Which is to apply some key principles of trauma-informed systems to thinking about our pedagogical techniques in the classroom. So I know the focus today is on pedagogy, but really that pedagogy is ideally taking place in a trauma-informed institution. SAMHSA, let's see, I'm always going to forget the names. Well, I'll look up the name later. It's a government official, a government agency, and I always forget the name. But, oh, there it is down there. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has a great guidance document that outlines really what it means for systems to be trauma-informed. And these are the key principles or features of a trauma-informed institution. And so that is that the whole institution realizes the prevalence and impact of trauma, recognizes the signs of trauma exposure, and then responds to promote healing and avoid re-traumatization. And again, we're going to think about that today in terms of pedagogy. We could have a whole nother larger conversation in terms of institutional approaches to achieving these features at the sort of larger systems level. Okay, so we're going to start with just some basic definitions so that we're all on the same page. So trauma goes by lots of different names these days. I don't know if you guys have heard of adverse childhood experiences, but that's kind of a current buzzword that people are using to talk about trauma and some other stressors. People might refer to toxic stress. The DSM in psychology, has a clinical definition of trauma. But for our work, we really think about trauma in ways that incorporate both the subjective experience and sort of the objective experience that we might have. And so at its essence, trauma is really the harmful interruption of some of our basic human needs around safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. So the traumatic event or potentially traumatic event really sort of shakes the foundations of our beliefs and our needs. The event can be acute and isolated, so you might get in a really serious car accident, and so that's an acute single trauma. But trauma can also be chronic. So I study community violence a lot in my work, and community violence is an ongoing traumatic experience. Traumas can add up over time and over the course of your development, so you can have cumulative exposure to trauma. And trauma can also become complex, and that is usually referring to really early childhood exposure that involves disruptions in the parenting, parent-child relationship, and also interpersonal violence. So there are lots of different ways to experience trauma. So the real key here, though, is that any event might interrupt some of our basic needs and could be chronic. And we would call that event sort of a potentially traumatic event. What makes the event actually, we cannot integrate that experience and sort of move from it, because it has exceeded our coping strategies, our coping skills, and we are sort of stuck in this place of interruption of these needs. So we can't restore them. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's just take a minute to talk a little bit more about what these basic needs and what trauma really does disrupt. And so safety is really at the heart of this, and historically has always been a part of the way people think about trauma. So trauma is usually defined in terms of sort of the degree of life threat that an event poses, but safety also refers to challenges to psychological and emotional safety. So those also are critical human needs. In terms of agency, trauma really sort of disrupts our sense of control over our behaviors and the consequences that result from our behaviors. So we generally like to believe that we have the freedom to make decisions, and we sort of understand that those decisions are going to lead to some predicted or reasonable consequences. But these days, or in the case of trauma, as you can see these days, a traumatic event really blows that to smithereens. And so, for example, in the case of George Floyd, he might have understood that there could be consequences to using a counterfeit $20 bill, but he certainly would have never imagined that those consequences would involve being murdered at the hands of police, right? So that sense of agency, the sense of control, is disrupted for trauma. Trauma also disrupts one's sense of dignity, so your place and power in the world. And again, a lot of the violence that we've been witnessing really just sort of demonstrates a lack of value of human dignity in what's been happening. And then also trauma disrupts a sense of belonging. I mean, trauma itself can be isolating, but it's also isolating because we often walk away from those experiences with a sense of guilt or shame that makes us feel othered in a lot of environments. So we feel like we can't connect to other people because of what we've been through and sort of how we are thinking about those experiences. So those are the disruptions that we're going to be trying to restore through things like pedagogical practices.
Stacy, if I just want to add here, the slides will be available. You'll make them available after this, so slides will be available, and we'll also have the recording available too. Thank you.
Great, sure. Okay, the other really important thing I think to talk about is that trauma operates at different levels, and we most commonly think about trauma as an individual experience, right? So this thing happened to this individual, and so they experienced trauma. But for the most part, individual traumas are not randomly distributed, and they're not independent. They tend to cluster together, and they tend to cluster together particularly for communities of color or other marginalized groups in our society, like LGBTQ communities. So just to break that down a little bit, so individual traumas can really be driven by this systemic policies or institutions, and we can think about this a lot in terms of sort of racist policies or institutions that really inflict trauma on entire communities. And then if we're a member of that community, we can experience that trauma either vicariously by seeing it happen to our community, or in some circumstances, it's both happening to the community and it's happening either directly to us or people that we love or are close to. So just a couple of examples of that. If you think about the federal policy that came out to separate families at the border as they were coming into the United States, that is sort of clearly sort of born of a racist attitude toward folks coming into the country. And it was a systemic policy that inflicted trauma on a whole community of people, right? And for Latinx people in our country, sort of watching that happen, that to their community is also represents a trauma experience for them. We can think about, I see this a lot in the kids we work with, the systemic racist policy of mass incarceration, or the criminalization of Black bodies. In our communities, we have a collective experience of people being victimized by mass incarceration, and that also impacts individual families and kids. So this collective nature of trauma and not just what's happening to the individual, because often what's happening to the individual is being driven by our larger policies and institutions. Okay, and then I also just want to acknowledge that there is certainly historical trauma, which can also be driven by systemic racism. So things like slavery, the Holocaust, Native American boarding schools, right? These are traumatic experiences that happened to collectives and individuals, and the impact was so powerful and intense, and there was, in the absence of healing, sort of that experience can get carried on across generations, either through behaviors that get passed down between parents and kids, but also actually through our DNA, right? Through the whole idea of epigenetics. So these experiences can change our genes, and we can pass those down and pass those experiences down intergenerationally. So trauma is a pretty complex and multi-layered process. Going to just do a quick check-in. Anything I can clarify there? Is that okay?
We have no comments, or no, we have no questions in the chat. So I think.
Okay, cool. Okay. So I also just want to mention resilience, because resilience is just a really important construct and sort of at the heart of trauma-informed pedagogy and trauma-informed systems. And again, we often think of resilience as an individual thing, right? Like, oh, she coped really well with that experience and now she's doing okay. But resilience is also collective. So what are the healing rituals in a community that help people and help communities move through trauma? What are systemic policies and institutions that can build resilience? And trauma-informed schools or trauma-informed institutions are an example of that, right? So they are trying to change the way institutions function in ways that promote resilience among people who've been exposed to trauma. So trauma, multi-layered, complex; resilience, also multi-layered, complex, and we all have a role to play in really fostering that resilience. Okay, so this is one of our 4 R's, a key feature of trauma-informed institutions. And so it's really important just to understand, how big is this problem in college students? So how often do our college students experience trauma? And so we're going to take a look at a couple of kinds of prevalence data. So so again, not my expertise, but I went into the literature to take a look at what's out there, and folks are studying this in kind of smallish samples, but I will say that most of the work is being done with predominantly white samples in university settings. And so, and actually a lot of the work is coming from the West Coast, and so they might have white and a large portion of Asian American populations, but Black populations in most of the studies are not well represented at all. But what we find across some studies is that in general, about 2/3 of the population of college students report childhood trauma. I'm going to tell you why childhood trauma is important later. But so they've experienced some trauma coming into the college setting. And this is pretty consistent with the famous ACEs study that found about this rate of exposure in the early 1990s when that came out. Of that 66% of folks who've experienced trauma, about 50% are walking in with multiple traumas. So they've had more than one trauma over the course of their childhood. I found one study that included just African-American college students. Half of the sample was at an HBCU and half of the sample was at a predominantly white institution. And in that case, we see that the rates of childhood trauma are higher. We also see this in the general child population that I'm familiar with. So about 74% of that African-American sample was walking in with trauma exposure, and about 2/3 of those folks had multiple trauma exposures, and the average was actually about 3. So our students are coming in, the majority of our students are coming in with a history of trauma. And then there's some other data to show that a lot of our students experience trauma in the years of college, right? And we know this through the sexual assault data and other data, but I think it's interesting from this longitudinal study that each year of the college experience, about 30% of students reported experiencing a trauma. And so you've got sort of the adaptations that might happen with childhood trauma coming sort of into play with ongoing traumatic experiences to really shape how students might learn and sort of move through the college environment. Looking at individual trauma, like we've been talking about, but again, if we only take that lens and ask people, how many times have you experienced these things, abuse or the loss of a loved one, right? That's one indicator of individual trauma, but it's really important for us to understand other types of trauma that our students are experiencing. And we can look at this in terms of police killings. So we know that unarmed Black folks are about 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white folks. And we also know that those killings happen with really no accountability. So this is data that spans 2013 to 2019. And you can see there that during that time, only 1 police officer who killed an unarmed Black person was actually convicted.
Hey, Stacey, we got a couple of a comment yeah, and then a question. Let's start with a question. Can you define childhood trauma? Does that mean under 12? Like, what's the operational definition of childhood trauma?
It varies. It depends on who you're talking to, but generally we're just going to say under 18. So from K through 12 experiences, yeah.
Okay. And then somebody asked about Hispanic populations. Are they also a significant representation? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I should really be saying Black and brown folks, because we, you can see here in this picture, right, that right now we're talking a lot about police killings of Black people, but we also know that this data indicates that Hispanic folks are also more at risk of being killed by police than are white folks. And if we had data on LGBTQ or trans populations, you know, again, so I'm focusing here a lot on the Black population, but other communities of color and marginalized communities have this kind of collection of trauma that's driven by systems. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, now I don't know about recently in this current year, but when folks were looking at the impact of that, so you might be like, well, okay, that's not really happening to an individual, so it's probably not that impactful, right? But again, this sense of collective trauma is important. So there are a couple of studies. This study came out in 2018, and frankly, just looked at, just interviewed Black individuals who lived in states where there was a police killing within 3 months of the time they're interviewed. Okay, so we don't know how they knew about it. Maybe they heard about it on TV, maybe they knew the person, but they just live in a state where a police killing of an unarmed Black person happened within 3 months of them being interviewed. And when they were interviewed about their mental health and the impact of that, Black Americans reported a bigger change in poor mental health days, so a greater number of poor mental health days in the month after those killings than white folks did. So essentially, white Americans up until this point have been generally unimpacted by the police killings of Black folks, but it impacts Black Americans, obviously. That makes sense, but I think it's just really important to point out the differential impact. There's another study that shows this. I couldn't find a study with college students, but this is with high schools. They used the same kind of thing where they looked at communities where police officers killed a Black person. And for Black students in those communities and Hispanic students, you could see a negative impact on their cumulative GPA, on high school graduation rates, and also on college enrollment rates compared to white folks who lived in those communities. So differential exposure, differential impact, really important to consider when we're trying to understand trauma. Okay, and the last example I'll give here is the collective experience of COVID-19 in the Black community has been very different, and also in the Hispanic community. In fact, the rates of death in the Hispanic community in some places are higher than the Black community. But anyway, we've also been experiencing this in our communities of color, and this sort of disparity is really driven by systemic policies and practices that have created racial disparities in economic opportunities, and also access to healthcare and trust in healthcare, right? So communities of color are disproportionately bearing the weight of COVID-19 deaths. And there's no outcome studies yet, but again, you can imagine then that if you're serving a population of Black students, they're going to be coming to you with a greater weight of COVID-related loss. Is likely to be impacted. Okay, I'm going to take a breath, see if there are any questions.
I think we're good.
Okay, so what's the impact of all that? So what happens when we have those kind of experiences and they pile up over time? There are a lot of negative impacts that can happen with trauma exposure, and those negative impacts tend to be the most devastating when that trauma exposure adds up in childhood. Although we can certainly have some of these effects, we do have some of these effects in adults, but we're probably, if you're like me, you're probably used to thinking about the impact of trauma in terms of mental health and emotions, and you may be less likely to be thinking about the impact of trauma in terms of physical health and or academic or cognitive functioning or brain development. So we're most likely to see the negative effects of trauma exposure when it happens chronically and it's compounded by other stressors. So a lot of trauma exposure with poverty, added on, right? So, and again, we're most likely to see these effects in childhood because our brains are really still developing in childhood. And so they're more vulnerable to the biological adaptations that can happen. But we can also see this in adults who experience chronic trauma. Okay, so what am I talking about seeing? What I really want to expose you to today is the biological adaptations that happen with these experiences, because again, I think most of us are used to thinking about the mental health end of things. But if we think about the actual biological adaptations that happen under chronic trauma exposure, I think it gives us a new lens. So what happens is, because our brains are really adaptable to our environment, if we're in an environment that feels dangerous or unpredictable, we are going to adapt to that environment, and we're going to get really good at detecting threat, right? So our primary goal is to survive and keep ourselves safe. And so if we're in a dangerous or unpredictable environment, we need to be good at knowing when threat is going to happen and when we need to react. And so what you see in kids exposed to chronic trauma, but again, you can also see this in adults, is that the amygdala actually gets enlarged. So the amygdala is the first responder to threat. It detects threat and it orchestrates the fight or flight response, the stress response, right? It kicks off the HP axis, which you may have heard more about. And so in conditions of chronic stress, the amygdala actually enlarges and it becomes hypersensitive to threat cues. So it's constantly in survival mode, looking for cues, responding to those cues, and also responding in a way that is really strong and lasts for a longer time than we would expect. Again, all this makes sense if you're living in a dangerous environment, right? You want to see the threat, you want to respond to it, and you're going to respond to it in a really powerful way. That's great. The problem is, when this is happening on a chronic basis, the very hormones and neurotransmitters that are driving our response and helping us survive are actually doing some damage to other parts of our brain that we really need to regulate our behavior and to learn and thrive. So in particular, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus in chronically exposed populations sustain some damage, and you can actually see shrinkage in those parts of the brain. And that can make it really hard to, again, sort of regulate the amygdala and keep it under control. But also it can make it really hard to problem solve and reason your way through things. So you're really going to be reactive and in survival mode. You're not going to be in reflective thinking mode, right? That's just not going to happen. So this is what happens under chronic stress and trauma, particularly in kids' brains, can also happen in adult brains, okay? So now I'm going to tell you what that looks like in terms of learning and behavior. So in terms of learning, when our amygdala is sort of in control and in charge, it can really make it hard to regulate or calm emotions. We're probably all experiencing this to some degree right now, right? With COVID-19, with the transition to teaching and the formats that we're teaching, with the racial justice issues that are happening, we're probably all a bit dysregulated. So our amygdala is sort of over-functioning for all of us. And when that's happening, it's really hard to regulate our emotions. And so it makes us increasing here makes us more vulnerable to either reminders of previous trauma or just again, things that would normally agitate us. And it then makes it harder for us to sort of manage our frustration and stay on task. It also makes it harder for us to want to take risks in our learning, because we just want to be sort of safe and sort of not take those kind of risks. We can have anxiety around our performance. We may withdraw, we may isolate. All of these things are going to have a negative impact on classroom performance, right? As well as social functioning and mental health functioning. So from a kind of a behavioral point of view in the classroom, is that behavioral or, yeah, I guess so. We're going to get those sorts of things. Also, sorry, my little thing is in the way. Shoot. Okay, I'm coming back. That was emotional, I think. But nonetheless, the other side of this is when we're also in survival brain, it's really hard to pay attention and you can sort of get distracted like I just did, right? It's hard to problem solve. It's hard to take other people's perspectives because, again, our prefrontal cortex is not as engaged as it needs to be. And then finally, with direct implications for learning and memory, when we're in this state, it is very hard for our hippocampus to help us learn and consolidate and store new information. So new learning is more effortful. It's going to take more trials. It's going to be more effortful. It just is the way it is because the hippocampus is having a hard time sort of functioning optimally. So either through biological adaptations that happen through chronic trauma in childhood, or through really overwhelming trauma that we might all be experiencing now, we and our students are going to have a hard time both emotionally regulating and sort of getting our optimal learning going. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions about that?
Anybody have questions, or are you doing okay? If you're doing okay, put a little thumbs up in the chat and I can.
Okay. If we're like that every day, we're going to have some negative outcomes. And I know the outcomes a lot better in young kids in school. So you can see they start having learning problems. They start having GPA or grade problems. The data in college students isn't quite as robust, but this is just some data I found from a 2019 study that you can see here on the bottom. Number of ACEs essentially means the number of traumatic experiences that college students report during their childhood. As those numbers increase, we see an increase in binge drinking and an increase in marijuana use for almost all groups. But interestingly, even though Black students tend to binge drink way less than white students under sort of no trauma conditions, right? As that trauma increases, we see that Black students, at least in this study, were at particular risk for that problematic binge drinking. In psychology, we tend to think about this as sort of like a self-medication process, right? So you're under this stress, you're trying to deal with it, and sometimes we use escape coping strategies to do that. And so we can see an increase in drug use and that sort of thing. But certainly there's discussion about this impacting attrition and retention in the college environment. Okay, that's the heavy part. We can all just take a deep breath, kind of let that out of our shoulders, and know that all of those negative outcomes are not inevitable. And we, as folks in an institution, can really help change the course for a lot of those outcomes when we focus on creating environments in our classrooms and on the campus in a larger way that really promote healing and avoid re-traumatizing our students. So the same document, the SAMHSA document that lists the key features of trauma-informed institutions.
Sorry, before you move too forward on, from the last study you present, were the students in that study from PWIs, HBCUs, MSIs, mixture?
It's a good point. This is, I know HBCUs, I don't think. It's kind of traditional college settings, and actually it's from college students in California and Minnesota, and so yeah, but not HBCUs specifically. And actually, it's a really good point because there are some students in it, but the majority of the students in the study are white and Asian. So there are only about 300 Black students represented in the sample. So we're talking about 300 compared to 5,000 white students, right? Okay. So we should be careful about sort of generalizing.
Awesome, Sid. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so here's the fun part. So how do we use trauma-informed principles to guide what we're doing in our classrooms? These are the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. They really guide all the work that we do in our work with teachers in K through 12 schools. And I want to just let you know that these principles have come from interviews with trauma survivors. So it wasn't folks in academia like me sitting there thinking, what do we really need to do to help make systems more supportive of folks? It was from the trauma survivors themselves who were seeking support from a lot of different systems in the community, human service organizations and that sort of thing. And these are the elements that they said they need to help them in their recovery, to heal and to move on. They're just kind of listed in the document, but I believe very strongly that at the base of any of our work has to be a cultural humility and a focus on educational equity, that we can't do any of this work if we aren't grounded in that. We do like 4 hours on this piece, so I'm just gonna say really briefly that that cultural humility really means both understanding systemic racism and the marginalization of underrepresented groups at a systems level, but also acknowledging our own biases and behaviors as it relates to race and gender is what SAMHSA talks about, but really as it also relates to mental illness, as it relates to sort of our biases around how we think teaching is best done, how we think students are supposed to learn, right? So, cultural humility expands all of that. And we really need to be aware of the biases that we bring. And sometimes we might say, oh, that's just passionate. I'm passionate about the way I want to do things. But it's really important to understand that there's not just one way to teach college students, right? There's some best practices, but we need to understand the benefits and limitations of those. So there's our own humility, but then I also think a big part of this cultural humility is just reaching out to others and understanding their perspective. So what does trauma mean to them? How has it impacted them? How have they internalized those experiences? How did they approach learning and moving through the college environment and culture? So really trying to take the perspective of the other and understand that their truth isn't as important as our truth, and we have to kind of work together to build an environment that manages all of that and creates educational equity, so that one size doesn't fit all in education. And I know that you guys particularly think a lot about this, but you know, particularly in K through 12 settings, I have teachers say, well, I can't give this person special treatment. I have to treat everyone exactly the same. And you know, that's just crazy, right? People come to this experience from different places, and we need to make sure they have equitable access to what we're offering, not the exact same sort of treatment or offering. Okay, so that's cultural humility. The ultimate goal is to really create a sense of safety, physical safety, psychological safety, emotional safety, transparency, and trustworthiness, so that your students can thrive in your environment. So these are all principles, but remember, when we think about what gets disrupted in trauma, safety is sort of at the core, right? And so we need to be able to reestablish a sense of physical safety. So thinking about your interventions for sexual violence on campus, or even our COVID-19 precautions, right? Even now, rethinking like campus police and what that might mean to students as they're coming back on campus. So physical safety is important, but also psychological safety in the classroom, and really trying to get a sense of what safety means to your students. Because again, what we think makes something safe doesn't mean it's gonna make things feel safe for your students. So really trying to be humble and understanding what that means, being transparent and trustworthy. So really showing genuine care for your students as a foundation for anything else that you do, being predictable in your routines, transparent in your approach to teaching, and the rules that you're making are really important. And so another 3 key principles as ways to get there. And so peer support is a key principle, really important to creating a sense of safety and trustworthiness. You can do this in your classrooms, obviously, by creating, peer groups where they're working on projects together or doing study groups, right? Another key principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. And so again, finding ways in your classroom environment to bring in things that will empower your students, feel like they have a voice in what's happening, and some choices in the way that you're structuring your classroom. And then collaboration and mutuality is also important. So again, sort of, if we think about the other things that get disrupted with trauma exposure and this sense of dignity and self-worth, right? If you're valued enough to have your professor collaborate with you or care about what you think about some things, that's going to help restore a sense of dignity and certainly also a sense of belonging. So, so these key principles, I feel like, are the strategies that we use to actually create the safe, transparent, and trustworthy environments. I will just say that in the one study that used African American samples from HBCU and PWIs, they looked at persistence from entry to, I think, through the second year, and they did find that this like academic integration, so a sense that I'm developing academically and my faculty cares for me, was actually a predictor of retention for Black females who had experienced trauma. So that sort of piece of being valued, being cared for, but also being developed and growing is an important protective factor. Okay, I'm just gonna take a breath and be quiet. This is kind of it before we can get into discussion. I have one more slide.
Would anybody like to unmute themselves? There's no comments in the chat. Would anybody like to unmute themselves and say something? Or we'll get to this one more slide and then get to our discussion. Stacy, I put in the chat that it's interesting that that my students mentioned transparency, no transparency in the discussion we had today, and that was their words, not mine.
Yeah.
What about, could you speak a little bit, this is from the private chat, could you speak a little bit more about voice? Should professors acknowledge that we understand what's going on, or just go on with our regular day? Like, what does that mean to you about voice? Is it, throwing this in their face can be traumatizing in the classroom where they might want to feel safe, but not acknowledging it might be problematic?
Yeah, I think that you have to be careful in those choices that you're making, but really it is finding opportunities to let students have their voice, right? And so sometimes that might be about an intense issue about social justice or racial violence, but sometimes it simply might just be about genuinely getting their voice on other content that you're learning or covering, right? So what are their perspectives on this body of knowledge? How do they think about these constructs? So I think voice can be achieved in a number of different ways, but I definitely agree that sometimes, and particularly now, I think folks are really exhausted and don't necessarily want to process some of the experiences that they're having. They just want kind of a space where they don't have to think about it. And so I wouldn't ever do kind of required discussions or experiences around that. If you can use choice, you can say, here are a couple of discussion topics, and maybe people could sort of select into a topic that they wanted to cover. I don't know if that makes sense. And the last thing I'll say about that is, if you're in a class where those kind of sensitive or hard topics are part of the content, then I think it would really benefit you to give folks some empowerment strategies in the beginning of the semester. So teach folks a little bit about relaxation, or using like their safe place that they can escape to for minutes psychologically, or bringing some fidgets to your classroom when you're back in person, or asking people to have something with them, during class, so that you're really giving them some skills that if you are pushing them a little bit to move into some difficult space, they've got some coping strategies to use as you do that. And I know we don't usually think about doing this in college courses, and 10 years ago, I learned a lot through this work, and I think it's really important and can be really valuable. That was a rambly answer.
Thank you. No, that's good. Let's move on so that we
Okay.
can then let people have the voice for them to talk. And now we're going to get into the groups to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we use this strategy with our teachers in K through 12, and it's pretty basic, but I think it's a good way to start thinking about this. It's just, we call it the start, stop, continue, change activity, where now that you sort of know what you know, and you've got some sense of the principles and what they might mean, you're probably already doing some great things in your classroom that incorporate some of those principles. So what do you want to continue doing? What might you be doing that you just want to tweak a little bit? But what are some cool things that you could start? And then also, what are some things you're like, oh, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that, you know, cold call out as students are sort of really stressed. So anyway, so I think the worksheet is there. It's got like the key principles and some definitions, and then just challenges you to think about some of those things.
Thank you. So this is what we're going to do, folks. Let's I want to be sure that we have time to talk about this. Jay just dropped this document into the chat, so you can see it there from Jay. You can look at the document. We're going to get in breakout rooms, let's say for about 8 minutes or so, and then we'll come back together, and we'll have a few minutes for people to report out. But when we come back, at least report out in the chat, because I can save the chat and then share those thoughts with other people. All right. Flo, does that sound like a good plan to you?
Yes.
All right. So I am going to, Dr. Overstreet, why don't you not get in a room yet? Just hang out in the main room, and then I can have you join, like maybe pop in other rooms and see what's happening. All right?
Yep.
Okay, so here we go. Putting you in a room now. I'm gonna time it about 7 minutes. When you get the invite, go ahead and join your room. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna kind of talk through this worksheet. See you when we get back. And I'm setting my timer. And did Flo go? What do you think about, oh, she left. What do you think about 7 minutes?
I think that's good. And sorry, that was long, but.
It's such good stuff. I know they can't, I mean, it always happens. So if we do 7, I'm gonna do 6 minutes. Oh, it's just, I want them to be able to talk. We're gonna do 7 minutes. That will come back with just 3 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, who's burning to say something? And then and then I'll just say, everybody else just kind of put your ideas in the chat, and we can grab them and share them with other people. Or I might say to Flo, hey, if you guys put in the chat if you're interested enough for us to have a follow-up, just kind of like a little discussion about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great job.
Thanks. And it is true, like each of these topics that I hit, we usually take at least an hour, and for the principals a lot longer. So like I'd be happy to come back and dive deeper into any of the stuff, but
okay. Yeah. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll do another one. Look, and as soon as you did that, I'm like, I'm getting a fidgeter. I'm going to tell my students that. But maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll see if you could come back and do the principles, just that, and then let people talk about that.
Yeah.
But mainly what Flo's objective, couldn't think of the word. Her objective is that she's having, both her kids are home. She is taking on this, she's got a grant. She's this leader in this grant. She's still teaching a class. And she just wants somebody to acknowledge that this is happening, you know? Yeah. And so she's really trying to get faculty then to do that for students.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, that's the one piece I had to cut, but the other big piece of our work is staff self-care. I mean, that's really more at the institutional level, but we're doing a lot right now. I mean, I wanted to focus this on the students. There would have been no time for that, but it is a really important part of the work, is that when we're asking faculty to carry the loads that we're carrying as an institution, we need to be sure that we're supporting self-care.
Yep.
Yep. And not just saying people to engage in it, but actually finding ways to really support folks' efforts in that.
And this is still getting recorded. I'm going to say that I could pause it, I guess, or but I want that in. That our institution needs to be engaging some self-care. Would you like to, because you just gave and you must be exhausted, do you want us to hang out here, or do you want to go join a room?
With the 3 minutes left, do you think it would be meaningful? I don't want to interrupt. Like if it was a half an hour, I'd be joining rooms, but I also feel like it might be disruptive to people's flow.
All right, I'm going to pause the recording then.
Halfway through the lecture, taking a couple of minutes, having this joke, who could figure it out. They seemed to like it. I thought it was so corny. I didn't think they would enjoy it at all, but they really got to enjoy that. So I would absolutely incorporate and keep that, but empowering them at the beginning to zone out. I thought that was huge. And that's a big takeaway.
I'm not sure, Tana, you could do this. Your classes are too large, but Danielle, if you're doing this, one thing I have done is I give students the option in class. I just say, if you need to come stand behind the plexiglass, I'll step back and you can take your mask off for a bit. Because it's uncomfortable to, have those masks like that. And I am now having students now finally take me up on it. And so they'll just kind of come up there, stand by, and I'll put my mask on and go. Now, you have a smaller room than you do, right? So I take my computer because I'm mixed mode. I go stand, keep talking, and let them kind of have that space for a bit too, which is kind of like a physical manifestation of that space.
Yeah, and I will just say that sometimes we're really worried that every moment of our class is so precious that how could we ever say to students, you can check out, or I don't have time for a commercial, but we're really talking about optimizing learning, right? So yes, every moment is precious, but if your students can't follow or they're not paying attention, then you're wasting time. The space, you're going to have a way more engaged class, and they're going to be able to benefit from you way better.
Sorry, I think the commercial was really something to engage students to actually learn, actively learn, but fun learning. Yeah. It was very light learning, but just content reinforcement, but nothing too out the box.
Yep.
So speaking of trying to have a trauma-informed institution, I want to be respectful of your time, and we are 3 minutes past our time. And I know some of you have kids to attend to, dinner to attend to, family to attend to, or just some self-care. Let's remember self-care. So if you will join me in giving Stacy Overstreet a clap. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for those of you who are putting things in the chat. If you want to keep putting things in the chat, we will gather those and share it. Florestina, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I also want to remind everyone or let you know that we will be having a follow-up to this session on next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. So you will probably receive that information from Jay. So please come back, tell others so that we can definitely continue this discussion as a Xavier community. And there was something else I wanted to say. I can't remember. It's so good seeing all of you. Thank you, Stacy, so much for a wonderful presentation and informative.
Thanks, Florestina, for making this happen. Yeah, if you all want to take the worksheet and then bring it back, and then because that's what we're going to do. Our next one is going to be all discussion. So thank you, Florestina, for reminding me.
Are you giving us homework, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm not giving you homework. I'm just saying, if you want, take it with you.
I'm just joking.
Or we can pick up there.
Please complete the survey.
Yeah, you will be getting a survey. Please complete that. You guys, it's so good seeing you. If you want to hang out, I'm sure Stacy will be willing to take questions. Otherwise, big XU hug to you all, and I'll see you around. Thank you.